Quite a bit in the agenda today. We're first going to start a tiny bit introduction, and then we're going to talk about the EU medical device regulation. But we're going to talk about the restricted materials section. We're not going to talk about the whole regulation. We're focusing primarily here on the materials restrictions. But we're going to talk some of the fundamentals on especially the materials restrictions, and then the timelines. Timelines are a big part of this and quite confusing, and then we're going to overview of the principal restricted materials requirements. Then we're going to go into each one in more detail. In particular, section 10.4 on substances. We're going to talk about design and manufacture, justification, the guidances or guidelines for justification, labeling. Then we're going to go to section 23.4S, information instructions for use. We'll talk about section 6.2D, additional information. And then beyond this, we'll talk a bit about how to manage global restricted materials compliance and practice, what's actually working for companies. In terms of legacy products that weren't necessarily designed with these regulations in mind, and also new medical devices, so future designs, new designs. How do you manage global restricted materials requirements? It's about 50 minutes long. The webinar should be about 50 minutes long or so, went a little over time this morning. And then we should have some Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to submit it in the control panel, and I'll try to get to as many as possible at the end. So a little bit about ourselves. We do a tremendous amount of laboratory testing or consulting in EU medical device regulation or the older directive, ROHS 2 and 3, the new phthalate requirements. REACH SVHC, we're easily one of the world leaders in REACH SVHC compliance or complying in practice. EU persistent organic pollutant, which is the one really to watch out for. There are more recalls in Europe for this than there is ROHS. REACH Article 67, in particular if you're looking at prolonged or frequent human contacting devices, the restrictions there are fairly significant. California, of course, California Proposition 65, one of the world leaders there. And the related requirements, the medical device US FDA, primarily around latex, Health Canada, primarily around DHP and BPA disclosure, and many other similar global restricted materials requirements, China ROHS, etc. We're arguably the highest volume restricted materials lab in North America. We do a tremendous amount of the work. A lot of what we're going to talk about today is very practical. We're going to talk about the regulation and what types of substances are an issue, but we'll actually talk very specifically about substance, materials, component types that are likely to run afoul of the MDR. So we have a lot of experience. We do quite a few thousand products a year. We do a tremendous amount of medical devices through our lab, plus also consumer and industrial and IVD and professional. Huge amount of products through here. We have a lot of experience. Let us help you. One of the big things that makes us different, our focus is different. We're not focused on the initial process. We're focused on the compliance and the end deliverables. What do you have to do to be compliant? What do you have to be compliant to? And what is the end deliverable? What is the output? To be compliant, what is the end output? And then once we identify the output, we work backwards to identify the process to create those outputs. If any step or process doesn't contribute to those outputs, it needs to be justified. We normally get rid of it. We're looking really on the outputs. For example, you don't just start data gathering. You'll figure out your output is first. And data gathering may or may not be a solution to it, but figure out your output is first. And then work backwards on how you're going to achieve that output. That's a big part of our focus. You're not doing compliance just for enjoyment. You're doing compliance because it's a requirement or restricted materials compliance. We prefer to look at what is the output for this regulation, because almost all the regulations have different outputs. What's the best way to get to that output? And so one of the big things we focus on is not selling a process. We work on what is the output and then what is the work we need to do to get to that output. So on to the EU medical device regulation. The new MDR, Regulation 2017-745 medical devices, which merges the old medical device directive and the implantables directive in one. IVD still has its own regulation. Even though it says April 5th on the actual text, it wasn't published on May 5th, 2017, and it goes into effect more or less May 26, 2020. We'll talk about the more or less part in a moment. So we're looking at a May 2020 more or less deadline, but we'll explain some of the details around that. The reason I'll explain about the more or less, and I really should mark graphs in this section and pictures. It's a bit complicated. Normally, for CE marking directives, the compliance requirement is any item, unit, placed on the market after the compliance deadline, in this case May 26, 2020, must be compliant with this regulation. However, and so any medical device placed on the market after May 26, 2020 needs to be compliant with the MDR, except if you still have a valid MDD certificate from a notified body. If you have a valid certificate from a notified body that's still valid to MDD, you can continue to sell the product even though it is not compliant with MDR after May 2020. So most certificates are valid for 5 years. There can be variances. For May 2017, so before the MDR was even published, you can continue to sell the product until even beyond 2020, even if the certificate runs out, which of course latest date will be May 2022. For any device you qualify from now on until May 2020, you can still qualify to MDD. And in many cases, you may still need to because a lot of the standards or requirements or guidances on the new MDR sections are not available yet. So if you qualify something in October this year, for example, chances are you're still using MDD with an eye on MDR, but still doing MDD certification. So anything certified to MDD instead of MDR, the old directive, the 1993 directive, between May 2017 and May 2022 can continue to be sold after May 2020 when the MDR goes into force, as long as it has a valid notified body certificate, up to a maximum of May 2024. That's the fundamental cutoff date. But if it's May 2022 and the product still has a valid notified body certificate for MDD, you can continue to sell it even though it's not necessarily compliant with the MDR. So the May 2020 date is when the regulation comes into force, when it applies to individual products. A new design after May 2020, a new certification will always have to use MDR, but one to have a valid MDD one that go past the May 2020 date can still continue to be sold, even though they're only qualified to the old MDD. So again, pre-May 2017 MDD certificates from notified bodies, legacy products, generally certificates are 5 years. They can continue to be sold until their notified body certificate is complete. If you've received a certificate post-May 2017, which is likely for anything you qualify this year, you only have to qualify in the MDD. And they can be continued to sold beyond 2020 as long as they have a valid certificate up to a max of May 2024. So yes, the compliance date is May 26, 2020, but for individual products, the actual specific compliance date may vary if they're still operating under a valid MDD notified body certificate. So sort of upshot, the summary is you're going to have different compliance timelines. This is actually one challenge you can have for project managing compliance to MDR, where you'll have a moving target depending on your product. You'll have individual products, very different products scattered with different compliance deadlines. Unlike EU ROHS, where everything basically happens on one date, you're looking at July 2014 or July 2021 for the new phthalate requirement. Here, the actual deadline for individual product will be often when it comes off certificate and needs recertification. So you have to look at it that way. So there will often you'll have compliance deadlines for legacy products, pre-2017 products, between 2020 and 2022. And anything you qualify from now to the start of MDR, you'll have to recertify them to MDR somewhere between 2020 and 2024. So you can have a variety of compliance deadlines for a variety of products. It's going to make the project a little more complicated. It's going to be reporting to management more complicated. It's not like how many are compliant by this specific deadline. It's scattered over a wider range, especially for legacy products. On the bright side, your workload, it can be more evenly spaced. It doesn't have this one spike to one deadline. You'll be able to spread them out a little more, which may work effectively. But the communication to management may be more difficult with the scattered compliance deadlines. So focusing more now really specifically on restricted materials compliance, the real focus here. It's contained in 3 sections, not 2. Section 10.4 on substances, which is the main heavy lifting. Section 23.4S, there's a lot of parts of information for instructions of use, but specifically the S section. And Section 6.2D, additional information required in specific circumstances or situations. So we're going to talk about each one of these 3. Most of the heavy lifting is in 10.4. So 10.4 has 5 sections. 10.4.1, design and manufacture of devices. 10.4.2, justification regarding the presence of CMRs or endocrine disrupting substances. And we'll talk about CMRs, carcinogen, mutagen, reproductive toxins, or endocrine disrupting chemicals, EDCs, called endocrine disrupting substances here. And then the 2 guideline sections, the section for creating the guidelines on phthalates and the section 10.4.4, guidelines on other CMRs and endocrine disrupting substances. So the plan is for them to create guidelines for the justification of phthalates first, and we'll explain all that. followed eventually by other CMRs like lead or nonylphenol or endocrine disruptors like nonylphenol ethoxylate. And then the related labeling requirements around restricted materials. So there's 5 sections, of which the first is kind of complicated because it's taken 2 different topics and merged it together without separating the section. So 10.4.1 really should have a section A and a section B. However, the first part, which should be section A, but it's a run-on sentence, 10.4.1, design and manufacture of devices. Devices shall be designed and manufactured in such a way as to reduce as far as possible the risk posed by substances or particles, including wear debris, degradation products, and processing residues that may be released from the device. So this is not about regarding specific restricted substances, it's really about residues or materials coming off the product. And these are mostly covered in a variety of ISO standards. There's a framework one, there's different ones for polymers, ceramics, metals. Many of them are in the midst of a refresh, so anything that's back in 2000 or 2001, there's going to be a 2017 or 2018 version very soon. They're all in a voting stage for renewal. So these are really around degradation. They're not really around materials restrictions, they're around degradation and residues and materials coming off the product. So there's a framework ISO standard, and there's one for plastics or polymers, ceramics, and metals and alloys. This is pretty consistent on the fact that the ISO standard is being updated with the old MDD. Now this section has another piece to it. 10.4.1 has got this section and this section. And this is around devices or those parts thereof or those materials used therein that are invasive and come in direct contact with the human body, administer or re-administer medicines, body liquids, or other substances, including gases to or from the bodies, or transport or store such medicines, body fluids, or substances, including gases, to be administered or re-administered to the body. So you're looking at invasive materials, you're looking at materials that contact gases or liquids being administered to the body, or gases and liquids being transported or stored, materials contacting those gases, transported or stored before being administered to the body. In any of these cases, when you have a material in these cases, it shall only contain the following substance and concentration that is above 0.1% by weight where justified. So it's not banned. These substances below are not banned, but they can only be used if justified. You have to justify them. So instead of being restricted, they're under justification. So as part of your notified body submission, we'll show later, you have to justify it. And the 2 types of substances are category 1, known to cause. So category 1A is known to cause in humans. Category 1B is known to cause in mammals or animals. Carcinogens, mutagens, and reproductive toxins, CMR. The other group is endocrine disrupting chemicals, EDCs. It's a newer group of restricted materials. Classically, when you look at ROHS or other restricted materials legislation, virtually all of the restricted materials are one of 2 families. They're either carcinogens, that cause cancer, or the reproductive toxins, they affect the reproductivities of mammals. There are very few mutagens. So when you look back at lead or mercury, PPB, you're really looking at carcinogens and reproductive toxins. Going forward, there are 2 new classes of restricted materials. One is persistent organic pollutants, which you see very commonly in both REACH SPHC and also in the EU persistent organic pollutant regulation. These are substances that build up in the environment, persist, and eventually build up to the point that cause harm, usually to flora and fauna. They're persistent organic pollutants. The other group is endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs. These are substances that are not necessarily carcinogens, not necessarily reproductive toxins, but sometimes they are. And they affect the endocrine system, primarily by causing an imbalance between testosterone, male, and estradiol, female, usually leading to proportionally low testosterone production. And in young males, low testosterone production manifests as anxiety. That anxiety to others is commonly called attention deficit disorder. So this group of chemicals, these EDCs, and the persistent organic pollutants are going to make up a decent portion of the new substance you see restricted. You commonly see lead restricted, which is a carcinogen, and you see it restricted in more and more uses. You're going to see new substances, ones that are not necessarily carcinogens and reproductive toxins, but are persistent organic pollutants and endocrine disruptors. These 2 families of substances are going to disproportionately make up the number of new restricted materials you see, whether in this regulation or REACH SVHC or otherwise. So in this case, if you have a known, category 1, carcinogen, mutagen, or reproductive toxin, or an endocrine disrupting chemical above 0.1% by weight, or in a material or component that meets one of the criteria above, it's in direct contact, re-administering liquids or gases, or administering or transport and storing for re-administration liquids and gases. You need to justify the presence of that substance. It's not banned, but you have to justify it. Typical CMRs and EDCs, endocrine disrupting. Most of the CMRs and endocrine disruptings of interest, most, not all, are in ROHS and include most of the REACH SVHCs. Not all REACH SVHCs are CMRs or endocrine disruptors. A good portion of the REACH SVHCs are also sensitizers. They're breathing lung sensitizers or persistent organic pollutants, neither of which are restricted under this section. Sensitizers are restricted somewhat later. SVHCs can be a variety of things. Decent portion are carcinogens or reproductive toxins, but some and a lot of the new ones are endocrine disruptors. So you're looking heavily at those and a few more. So the key substances, for the most part, in practicality, the ROHS2 substances, lead, cadmium, mercury, hexchrome, PBB, and PBD, all of which are CMRs. ROHS3 phthalates, DHP, BBP, DBP, and DIBP, which are all reproductive toxins, and DHP and endocrine disruptors. And then you're also looking at beryllium copper, not because the copper part, beryllium itself is a CMR, it's a carcinogen, and since it's an alloy, beryllium is on its own. So beryllium is a carcinogen, and that's a particular issue. If you have beryllium copper, particularly in electrodes in an invasive situation, you're looking at beryllium copper, nonylphenol ethoxylate coatings or adhesives, and DMAC. So DMAC is a very common solvent. It's used in the fabrication of Kapton, spandex, elastane, lycra. It's what's used to dissolve the non-woven fibers to make them. And the fibers afterwards, the Kapton, which is flexible PCB circuits, or it's that orangey yellow tape you often see in products, or spandex or lycra or elastane will have residual DMAC well above 0.1% by weight. So will require justification. Key risk areas to start with, those are the materials, PVC tubes. PVC tubes very commonly use the phthalate groups, the low molecular weight, DHP, etc. They can be made with other ones, adipates, terephthalates, totem, which still has residual DHP, but well below 1,000 ppm. So those tubes, unless you design specifically otherwise, are very commonly using DHP, but you can buy them, or design them nowadays using alternative materials like adipates or terephthalates. The phthalates above are really orthophthalates. So substances people always call phthalates are really orthophthalates. The terephthalates, which are very similar, do not have the reproductive toxicity or endocrine disrupting capability of the orthophthalates for one reason or another. Neoprene also needs phthalates to be flexible. Nitrile gaskets, if you have nitrile gaskets anywhere in the gas or a fluid path going into the body, nitrile gaskets will very commonly contain phthalates, also known as lead. Brass valves and connectors, if you have anything in the your breathing tube or your pump, touches that are brass, and fluids and liquids, fluids and gases very commonly have brass connectors. Those are normally leaded. They'll have lead well above 0.1% by weight. And of course, they're touching the air or gas on the way in, so they require justification. And then Kapton, which is the flexible circuit boards, or the tape if it's in human contact, or fluid or gas, or spandex or elastane or lycra. If those materials are invasive or touching the path, they're very likely to contain DMAC. Whether it's harmful or not, you have to provide justification and very likely labeling. We'll talk about all of that. So these are the key substances. They're not necessarily everything that can affect you. People look at the CMR list, and depending how you define it, there's between 400 and 1,400 CMRs. Most of them are either petrochemicals. There are a variety of different distillates of petrochemicals, or they're nickel salts. Every single nickel salt is on there. Outside of those, the main ones they're concerned about here are the ROHS2 ones, ROHS3 phthalates, beryllium, because of beryllium copper, nonylphenol ethoxylate, and DMAC. There could be others, but these are basically 95 to 98% of your risks. Now, I said it's not restricted. You need to do a justification. So section 10.4.2 covers justification. It's not, these CMRs or endocrine disrupting chemicals or substances are not restricted. You just have to justify them. And the justification for the presence of such substance shall be based upon an analysis and estimation of potential patient or user exposure to the substance, analysis of possible alternative substances. This is one thing they'll focus on. Similar to ROHS exemptions, you have to show why you've tried them out or why the alternative materials won't work. So using DHP, why can't you use DOTP, the terephthalate? Why not? Why can't you use DINCH or similar? Why possible substances and or material substitutes or design changes are inappropriate in relation to maintain the functionality, performance, and the benefit-risk ratios of the product. You can say, I can't use adipates in this as a plasticizer. Well, these people do. It becomes very difficult. So if somebody else can do it, this justification becomes far, far more difficult. It also has to take into account the latest scientific committee guidelines in accordance with section 10.4.3 and 10.4.4, which we'll discuss in the next two sections. There's basically parts of legislation that will set up guidelines at some point in the distant future to base some of these justifications on, including benefit and risk ratios. The biggest concern is where somebody's replaced it effectively in the same use, the justification is very difficult. It is very difficult. You notice cost isn't here. It's benefit risk ratio. Cost isn't here. Cost is not one of the criteria. It's got to be functionality and performance. Cost can play into those, but it is not a section itself. So it's not banned, but you have to justify it. And one of the key concerns, you have a number of issues here. First of all, is when you're submitting the justification, there's always the concern that it doesn't pass. And so if you have a substance that meets one of these criteria, they can have to do a justification for. You'll probably get more churn or communication from management engineering than you'd like. Where, well, what if we try this? Are we really going to pass? How are you sure? Etc. Because this situation can block the certification of the device. And so there will be concern. It's an unknown. Specifically, the guidelines are still in flux. This is going to be an unknown. Sort of the material that you want to get rid of if possible. Because if you don't have this material, you don't have to do the justification. But if you have a CMR and EDC above 0.1% by weight in a material that's invasive or contacting the air or gas going in, you need to justify. And there'll be continuous churn throughout the whole thing where people are, well, are you sure? Are you really sure? So on and so forth. Well, so-and-so said this, and then you're going to probably get clippings or mails from other people. The sky is falling, so on and so forth. It's one of the, and just in practice, one of the most, probably the most time-consuming part for you, for the people involved in this, is not the justification per se. It's the churn and concern you're going to get from management that they're worried that, what if it doesn't pass? And then can you present to so-and-so about why you think its capacity justification is going to work? Or this competitor has a replacement. Will that cause problems for us? Especially if the competitor has a replacement, 11th hour before you submit your justification. It is a lot of churn here. So it's not banned, but it's in a lot of ways for the restricted materials prime, the person stuck with the rule, creates a lot more churn than what it would be if it's banned. Banned would be easy, just replace it. This case, this is justification. We can still use it, but are you really sure we're going to get through with it? It's going to complicate your life if you have to do a justification. It's one of those practical things. So in terms of justification, there is a section 10.4.3 where they're to create guidelines on justification for phthalates. By May 26, 2018, they're not going to create the guidelines. This is an amazing part of the whole regulation, is they will eventually, they're supposed to have a scientific committee with a mandate to make the deadlines by 26th of May 2020, when the regulation goes into effect, which is not very helpful if you're trying to design to the MDR beforehand. And will the EU complete this? Absolutely. They basically complete everything they started to do. But did they do it on time? No. So chances are they'll both be late. There's going to be a lot of consultation, different opinions. It's going to be an exciting whole play in the background. During the opinions, you can have other people in the space come on and say, hey, we replaced the thadapates, so we don't have to use DHP. DHP is not justified in this circumstance. And people arguing back and forth, well, our application is a little bit different, or that's a certain type of application, etc. It's going to be exciting, in air quotes. The mandate for the committee shall encompass at least a benefit risk assessment in the presence of phthalates. So when they get the mandate is going to include a benefit risk assessment of the presence of phthalates. And the benefit risk assessment shall take into account the intended purpose and context of the use of the device, as well as any available alternative substances, alternative materials, designs, and medical treatments. So they're going to put out, by the way, consultations for people to say, hey, submit it. We have these situations. Are there replacement? People come, no, we've replaced the phthalates. We don't need to do this anymore. It makes it very difficult for the people using, say, phthalates. And this benefit risk assessment shall be updated every 5 years. This process, where they're going to look at alternative substances, they're going to ask for feedback. People that have replacements are going to feed it back. It's a real challenge. So people will have materials that require justification. This is going to create a lot of uncertainty, whether it's phthalates or lead or otherwise. Now, section 10.4.4 is they're going to create guidelines on other CMRs and EDCs once they've done it for phthalates. When, who knows? So we're looking at lead or nonylphenol ethoxylate or beryllium. They'll eventually have guidelines also. When, who knows? Not in time for the regulation though. And so the law is here, but when it'll happen, it's going to have a lot of steps in between. And so this is in the far distant future. This is when's, by then my children are probably through high school and out into college before this occurs. So it's going to create also a concern where you're looking, okay, I don't have phthalates, I have lead. What's the benefit risk ratio? How am I working in this situation? So again, you're going to see a lot of churn. One of the big recommendations right now is find out which ones you have that are in this situation and then use your time properly to hopefully redesign it. Because if you cannot design it out, not for cost reasons, just physically can't, your justifications have been easy. But if it's just for cost, it's going to be a tough sledding to get past that risk-benefit analysis, especially if people will be submitting their own opinions that they have replaced it. So that's going to create a challenge. And there's going to be concern. You'll see press clippings, and you'll probably get this from management. Hey, we still use phthalates, some of our parts. I'm getting these things. Are you absolutely sure the justification is going to go through? I don't want this to be a stop ship. So this uncertainty between these sections is not going to be a lot of fun, often for the prime, the restricted materials. So just give you guys a heads up. This is because it's not a go, no go, as opposed to ROHS, not a clear thing. No, we have it. We have to replace it. This has got that wishy-washy justification. It can create a lot of churn for you. Last section is labeling and a whopping load of text. So basically, when devices, parts thereof, or materials used therein are referred to in section 10.4.1. Okay, so what this really means is, back the first section we just talked about, if you have a CMR, category 1, known to cost, or endocrine disrupting substances above 0.1% by weight in a situation where it's invasive or it touches fluids or gases that go into the patient one way or another, you have to label the device and or the packaging, or where appropriate, the sales packaging with a list of the substances. Furthermore, if the intended use of such device includes treatment of children or treatment of pregnant or breastfeeding women or treatment of other patient groups considered particularly vulnerable, information on residual risks for those patient groups, and when appropriate, precautionary measures shall be given in the instructions for use. This one's going to be exciting because the precautionary statements for reproductive toxins like phthalates is not usually popular. Should not be in contact with women of childbearing age, should not be contact children, be kept out of the reach of children, handle with gloves. That's reproductive toxins. This might create other challenges. So labeling is one thing. It used to be just label for DHP. Now it's a wider range of substances. You might have put lead, DHP, and nonylphenol ethoxylate. And then if the device can be used on children or women of childbearing age or vulnerable groups, you have to actually provide warnings in the instructions for use, which for reproductive toxins or endocrine disruptors are not popular. So again, the labeling. If a substance requires justification, you also will have to label for it on the device or the device packaging, or where appropriate in the sales packaging if the device and device packaging don't work. Now, the details in the law about which one you can choose are a little vague. There'll hopefully be guidance at some point in time saying when you can put on the packaging or when it has to go on the device. And so you have to label category 1 CMRs, or again, the endocrine disruptors, if they're above 0.1% by weight in an invasive or liquid or gas contacting situation. Same situations as justification. Historically, it's just used to be the DHP label, where you have the packaging, the product, it's got a little catheter connector piece, lure lock, whichever, DHP, says DHP and label, that's all you had to do. Now you have to justify it, and then you have to label all of them. So it could be DHP, it could be lead, it could be nonylphenol ethoxylate, depends what occurs in your situation. And it includes the gas or liquid paths. When you go upstream in a ventilator or a feeding pump, you're looking at brass in any of the connector, lead and brass in the connectors, etc. Then you'd have to label those. So lots of good fun there. So if you have to justify, you're also going to have to label. Labeling is going to be a bit of a nuisance, but compared to the uncertainty around justification, pretty easy sledding usually. Now, again, as I mentioned in the previous, if the medical device intended to be used for the treatment of children or pregnant or breastfeeding women or treatment of other vulnerable groups, you have to provide precautionary measures shall be given in the instructions for use, which again, for reproductive toxins and endocrine disrupting chemicals are not popular. Which basically, endocrine disrupting chemicals should not contact male children under the age of 14. It's a kind of a big deal. Reproductive toxins, again, should not contact women, childbearing age, children, handle with gloves. These are not usually precautionary measures that are popular for more invasive devices or materials. So the challenge with labeling is not just the label itself, but actually writing in the precautionary or the instructions for use around the precautionary measures may not always be popular. Now, related to that, sort of weaker, there's also the more information instructions for use. Very much in the lines we just talked about, but there's more to it. The instructions for use shall contain all the following particulars. There's a whole bunch of stuff, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and it goes down to S. So S is information that allows the user and or patient to be informed of any warnings, precautions, contraindications, measures to be taken, and limitations of use regarding the device. The information shall, where relevant, allow the user to brief the patient about any warnings, precautions, contraindications, measures to be taken, and limitations of use regarding the device. The information shall cover, where appropriate, a whole bunch of things. Amongst them, precautions related to materials incorporated into the device that contain or consist of CMR substances. Now, it doesn't say category 1. There should be guidance on it and say, yes, they meant category 1. Known to cause, opposed to category 2, potential. Category 2 is a very low bar to be classified as a category 2. Shouldn't really be here. Consist of CMR substances, should be category 1, or endocrine disrupting substances, or that could result in sensitization, allergic reaction. So this is the first time sensitization is kicked in, allergic reaction. Classically, this used to be latex, but they don't say latex anymore. They say sensitization, allergic reaction, which brings nickel into play. Not to mention some other materials, but nickel very heavily gets brought into play as a dermal sensitizer. About 10% of the population is heavily allergic to nickel. It brings nickel in. This brings in stainless steel to a certain extent if it has any nickel migration. Stainless steel very commonly has nickel. You have to make sure it's high quality so it doesn't have nickel migration. But it can if it's done improperly. So you're looking heavily at latex and nickel and potential chromium and some other allergic substances or sensitizing substances. So these are sensitizers. There's also respiratory sensitizers. Now, it's more of a problem if your product is a dust or airborne. That's usually not really a problem in most physical medical devices. But you're definitely looking at allergic reaction. If you make wearable devices or more consumer devices, the number of materials that can have the potential for sensitization goes up, often due to prolonged contact. If it's a wearable, some kind of blood pump or other measurement device that stays on, or implantable device, sensitization is a big deal. And I mentioned a little briefly beforehand, implantables are part of this. So implantables have all these requirements also. Definitely invasive. These restrictions apply to implantables. As implantables have moved into this regulation from a separate one. IVD is still separate. IVD doesn't have to do any of this. Feature diagnostic does not have these requirements. It's different regulation. Implantables and regular medical devices do. One of the last sections, section 6.2D, additional information required in specific cases. So under section 6, product verification and validation, basically details submitted to the notified body. Additional information required in specific cases. Part D, in the case of a device containing CMR endocrine disrupting substance referred to in section 10.4.1, again, the ones that require justification, the justification needs to be submitted. This probably makes sense. You have to justify to someone, so the justification is part of what gets submitted to the notified body. Pretty standard stuff. You submit the justification as part of your notified body submission. It's probably not really a surprise, but it's specifically part of the submission to the notified body, the justification element. So now to talk about this in practice, we talked about MDR. There's a lot of regulations in space. How do you comply in practice? The ones here are the main ones. There are others. The main ones that apply to medical devices. The EU Medical Device Regulation, and currently still the Medical Device Directive. US FDA requirements around latex. And we see a lot of companies going afoul of that right now. It's kind of complicated. It's not that necessarily have latex in their product. It's just in the manufacturing process, they use elastic bands. That's natural rubber latex. It contacted the product. That's a problem. It will leave proteins behind. There is no minimum threshold for proteins, for natural latex proteins. You can't do that. That's a particular one. Or we've seen in the packaging. We've shipped it, and it's wrapped in an elastic band. You can't do that. That's natural rubber latex. That's a problem. That's an FDA issue. Health Canada around declaration DHP and BPA as part of device licensing. California Prop 65. The EU persistent organic pollutant, which is one of the most heavily enforced, particularly around the chemical short chain chlorinated paraffins, whether in the EU or again in Canada. The REACH Article 33, the SVHC communication requirements, very commonly needed. A decent portion of medical devices have REACH SVHC communication requirements. And the REACH Article 67 restrictions, more so on products that are consumer or prolonged human contact, especially on nickel or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PHs. The nickel one in particular for wearable devices is a big deal. It's a very easy one to get recalls on because when people's skin reacts, it bubbles. They don't have to do a complicated test that the skin's bubbling. For electronics, you also have ROHS recast. You have the new ROHS 3 with phthalates in 2021, and China ROHS and other requirements. So there's a tremendous amount of very applicable and enforced regulations in this space. One of the big challenges is how do you comply to all these things, and not necessarily everybody recognize all of these or realize that EU POP is a big deal in terms of enforcement, or what the requirements really are. So a lot of challenge for medical devices is nobody has unlimited compliance requirements. One of the fundamental rules of restricted materials compliance is restricted materials prime can do anything they want as long as it's free, but this sort of thing isn't. So nobody has unlimited compliance resources, especially for legacy products. Often new products have a compliance budget and a compliance program. Legacy ones that weren't designed to meet newer regulations often do not have the budget set aside to do compliance. But they still need to be compliant. They're still being sold. They need to be compliant. In a lot of these cases, the regulations were not included in the original product design. So when it was designed, the drawings or specifications do not include compliance to all these requirements. Sometimes they include ROHS, but that's usually as far as it goes. We had about 8 or 9 or a dozen on the previous page. Suppliers often have reasonable ROHS data, but are significantly lacking extended requirements. In particular, as the new requirements, the circuit board components are less and less involved. They're not a Prop 65 issue. They're not a POP issue. They're less and less of an ROHS 3 issue. They're not an MDR issue. As it moves to more custom components, the different pieces that you design by drawing and you specify, and you're not buying off the shelf, as more and more compliance requirements go to those contract manufacturers or fabricators do not have the compliance data for your custom parts. So as a lot of the compliance requirements start shifting more to custom parts and away from the circuit board, data gathering, especially with the extended requirements, is not very fruitful. There is huge value in specifying up front what you need the product to be compliant to and working with suppliers, but gathering data after the fact is usually not very fruitful, especially beyond ROHS. There's a lot of complexity that you have to explain to a large range of stakeholders. The regulation we talked about previously, they're all different. Some are the same as similar materials. Their outputs are different. Some are declarations, some are not. Some are stop ship, some are not. The materials are slightly different. The thresholds, article, material, homogeneous, they're all different. And the people on this call are very knowledgeable. Even for people here, a lot of this adds a lot of complexity or some uncertainty. Explaining this to other stakeholders, whether management, which may not have a long attention span for this sort of thing, or engineering, is difficult. So it creates a lot of complexity. You don't have unlimited resources. You still need to be compliant. It was not included in the design. Supplier data is just not effective for most extended requirements. And there's a lot of complexity to explain to stakeholders or suppliers. So how are effective companies complying? Because people still have to comply. So how are people doing it effectively? You can't do everything perfectly, but how can you do it pretty darn well? So the most effective medical companies are doing it this way, and we see this, and this is actually working tremendously well. In a lot of cases, you don't know what you don't know. And so what a lot of companies are, the really effective ones are, they're not trying to solve everything. What they're doing is they're taking testing, usually with us, a representative product from each product family. Often a lot of companies make a variety of variations or kittings or variations on this product. Test one of them for the extended requirements. And the funny thing about the extended requirements, once you're testing for one, you can test for the others. They're just variations, same equipment, variations in the process and thought process. So they're very efficient to do in common. And they test a representative product and then learn from it and apply the findings to a wider range. They have a non-compliance issue or stop ship issue. Obviously, that takes priority, focusing on the business affecting results. But a lot of them are declaration. And the declaration created for one product is often very extendable across the whole family. We may have to declare DHP in the catheters. So how different are the rest? Can we apply it broadly? And learn from it. And there's a lot of surprises to it. It's amazing how people get surprised, depending also what materials are controlled. It's a very effective way to get a very high compliance for the minimum cost. From that, also, what is often found, if you do the work and you have a result, and you apply it across the families, and you turn to be wrong for one family, at least when you have an enforcement issue, you can go back and say, look, we did try sampling legacy, and this is what we did do the right thing. And for a lot of the modern regulations, the enforcement is proportional. It's proportional to the offense. And if you've done a lot of work, the enforcement is usually proportionally much less. Normally, fix it on the next batch, which is a big deal. And so also in a practical sense, what a lot of companies do is they find a stop ship regulation, ROHS 3, medical device regulation, POP, CalProp 65, something very business affecting. And they use that as saying, look, we need to comply to this. Why don't we do the rest at the same time? Because it's very efficient to do them together. And what we're going to do is just do one of each family and learn from it. And if they're compliant, let's keep going. We've already done ROHS. It's one of the ones that's a per material level. We'll test an individual representative. So we can't do everything. We'd like to, but we can't do everything. Do one representative of each product. Take the findings from it, particularly the declarations. A lot of the new regulations are declaration-based as opposed to stop ship. Create the declarations for them. If we have a non-compliance, deal with that non-compliance and then move forward. And handle new designs differently. Nobody has unlimited budget. You can't fix all the legacy products at once. What is usually effective is saying, look, we have this mandatory compliance requirement, MDR, ROHS 3. What we suggest is we can test one of each. We can get a hard result, learn from it, and then try to apply it as broadly as we can to all the variations in the design. It's not perfect, but it's very hard to be perfect for legacy devices. If you start getting a lot of failures, maybe you expand it because if you have a significant continuous stop ship issue, sure, there's a business reason to extend it. But normally you test one, representative one, and learn from it and then apply the wider findings. You also will find as a research and materials prime, you get a lot more buy-in forward because you'd be able to bring to engineering and saying, look, we have a problem with this material or this thing. And it's very tangible. And it's a lot easier instead of hand-wavy data gathering, you see tangibly, it's this part and this material that's giving us the issue. And it helps improve also their understanding of the compliance world. New medical devices, most medical companies work with just ship them to us. It's easier for them for a new design. Why? Well, a lot of them actually have a compliance budget. It's just easier. But from the product manager, what makes his life easier is they have all those compliance requirements, previous slides, 12 compliance requirements, whichever, they can turn into a checklist. They send it to us, they all get checked off, and they can move on to other things. It's also got the testing approach, is testing and engineering evaluation for us, has a short and clear timeline for completion. You know how long it's going to take, you know when you're going to be done. You may have to change material at that point in time or one part, but you have a set timeline. This process is not going to gate your device release. That's a big deal. We do it this way, we will be done in time. It provides tangible outputs. One of the challenges of data gathering is we've never really seen anything except for maybe ROHS, and that's kind of a maybe, because we test for ROHS all the time, and lots of products with a lot of data gathering actually don't comply when you actually test them. The data does not often produce tangible outputs. It's hard to put together an SVA. I've gathered data, I'm missing data, it's incomplete, I'm not sure everybody understood everything. Creating a REACH SVHC declaration out of that is tough sledding. Nice thing about the testing approach, it provides you an output. Here is your declaration. That simplifies. It's a checkbox. The product manager for a new design has too many things to do. I've got my declaration, like I have my CE mark, my tech file, my DOC. It's just an output. And it's a lot more effective in terms of both compliant. It works way better than other methods for compliance, especially data gathering. It's usually far less costly, mostly in churn. The internal resource usage is very low. You get it done, you move on. If you have a problem, it's specific. You fix that specific issue, and you get it done in time that it doesn't gate the device release. And there's more and more requirements. What you saw 4 or 5 years ago is very different from what it is now. REACH SVHC list is much bigger. The EU PUP is a big deal. You have the MDR coming online. You have the extended requirements appearing in ROHS. It's going to be a lot harder and more complicated. Trying to express this to more stakeholders is going to be difficult. Expressing to your supply chain, where some of these are very semantics based, especially if they're not English first language, is going to create challenges. We find for new design, this is one of the easiest ways. Get an answer, find out what you have to solve it, move on. Don't gate your new release. And compared to other medical device certifications, the restricted materials testing is trivial. So again, one of the things that makes this difference, we focus on compliance and deliverables. What do you have to be compliant to? What is the output deliverable? How do we get to that deliverable? If anything doesn't help get to that deliverable, cut it out. We just want to get to the deliverable. You, to sell, you need to be compliant. You need to have this end output, declaration, COC, DOC, etc. This tech file, this is what the output is. Let's draw a line from where we are today to get to that and not fiddle-faddle a whole bunch of other things. What's the output? Focus on the output. How else can we leverage other work to get to that output? Data gathering may contribute. We find data gathering for a lot of the new requirements is not helpful, is far more effective from time and compliance to move the requirements up front in specifications so your suppliers know what they're supposed to be designing to or building to. Same way you do with quality specs or finishes or materials you use, it's just another specification. The farther up front you move it, the more likely your supplier is going to comply to it. Kind of a big chunk of it is. If they don't, one of the other fundamental rules of restricted materials compliance by far is the things you're most likely to be non-compliant for are the things you didn't know about. And that goes for you and your suppliers. If they don't know what they need to be compliant to, then they're likely to be non-compliant for it. Coming back and asking for data after the fact for new requirements is not part of specifications difficult, which brings in the third rule of restricted materials compliance. It's much easier to get data before you buy something than afterwards. The retroactive data gathering is not normally very practical. Not only do they not necessarily have it, they haven't been given the opportunity to design it. It wasn't part of the specification. So it's more than data gathering. Moving the spec up front so the supplier knows what they're supposed to be doing is far more helpful than in actually being compliant than trying to gather data after the fact. And as you go forward, more and more of the restricted materials compliance will focus more on the custom parts of materials versus the off-the-shelf. That you're going to realize more and more it's your design that has to be compliant, not the part you buy from DigiKey or Newark. The more and more the compliance burden, the material types are less and less circuit board and standard electronic components and moving to other materials. So again, we do a tremendous amount of testing and consulting in the medical, but also consumer and industrial and professional and IVD. We do testing and evaluation to the EU MDR and the current MDD, ROHS 2 and 3, REACH SVHC, we're probably the leading provider in there. EU persistent organic pollutant, which is a big deal from stop ship point of view. REACH Article 67, especially for items of prolonged human contact, Prop 65, the related US FDA, Health Canada, and a variety of other global requirements like China ROHS. We find once you're doing one, if you structure your process properly, it's not that hard to do the other. It's the same others. It's the same equipment. You just need to make sure your process handles the variations. We're arguably the highest volume restricted materials lab in North America, especially for medical devices. We do quite a few medical devices a day here. Let us help you. Before I get to Q&A, again, everybody who's registered, not just showed up today, will receive a copy of the presentation, and it should be a recorded version online sometime by the end of the week. This is a good question. The first section of 10.4.1 apply to all MDDs or also only those in body contact? It applies to all MDDs. This is the one about degradation products, but the ISO standards will focus very heavily on the ones where you could have a human exposure. If the degradation product won't get in the humans, it's not an issue. There's the second section, invasive, then by definition not apply to skin contact, but non-invasive devices. So it would not, it has to be invasive. So again, on the dermal contacting, non-invasive, like a Band-Aid, I believe it would not contact. I'd have to look at what the definition, and hopefully there's probably a lot of definition of invasive, but it has to be body contact in invasive. And it has to touch, basically it has to touch fluids, blood, or other fluids. Milk, etc. So the skin, you could argue probably heavily it's not touching fluids. If my device is invasive, but the critical material in question is encapsulated in housing, i.e. an active device for neurosurgery where a steel tip is invasive, but the electronic portion with circuit board is in a housing, it is in scope of 10.4.1 and 10.4.2. It is in scope, but only the part that's invasive. So if it's not going to make the contact, so it's devices and parts or parts therein. So if it's not in a fluid or gas contacting situation, those particular materials do not require justification. So imagine you have a leaded brass standoff, which is not uncommon, holding up your circuit board inside your medical device that's encapsulated, and what's touching is the outer, we'll say not polycarbonate, ABS portion of it. Then the internals that happen to be leaded brass do not require justification. They are not invasive or contacting fluids or gases. Another great question. Is the percent by weight limited to just the invasive patient contact portion of the device, referring to the whole device? It is not well explained. However, the way they said or parts therein, it looks like they are discussing the material in contact. So it's percent by weight of the material in contact as opposed to the device. There should be more guidance on it, but the most reasonable way they've written it would be the percentage of the material in contact with the invasive or gas or liquid. Why did you put ROHS under electronics? Isn't ROHS now required for all parts of the medical device? Great question. ROHS only applies to electrical electronic equipment, so it only applies to medical devices that have an electronic function. And that doesn't include purely optical, but it has to have an electronic function. So if a medical device does not have electronic function, then ROHS doesn't apply to it. The cadmium restriction is also common to REACH itself as a REACH restriction. So some of the restrictions appear otherwise, even if it's not in scope of ROHS, but ROHS only applies to medical devices that have an electronic function. If the medical device has no electronic function, then it's not in scope. What is the particular test that is done to show if your device contains a CMR or endocrine disruptor? That's a fantastic question. So the way we have to do it is we have to, like we do for each SVHC, you have to take a risk-based approach, is what they recommend. We look at the material and what CMRs or endocrine disruptors could possibly be in there. We use also, of course, our lab has screening techniques where we can screen out the common ones or screen in. And depending on the material, there are different tests. It is not one test. The different CMRs have different approaches. The metals are easier to screen using XRF or ICP. Beryllium is the ICP pretty well only because of low molecular weight. But there's a number of techniques. There's a lot of advanced techniques for each one. These endocrine disruptors, the same way you handle REACH SVHC. What materials are reasonably likely to contain endocrine disruptors or CMRs? So in our case, we do a tremendous amount of it. So we have this fairly significant knowledge base, both in engineering evaluation, but also in screening and testing techniques. It's pretty advanced here. This is a really specialized field of it. One of the reasons why also testing a representative product is really useful, you learn a lot. Will the Q&A be made available to attendees after the webinar? Well, it wasn't really planned to be, but I haven't turned off record yet, so I'm guessing it is. ROHS applies to all parts that are a necessary part of an EE. That's a really good question. ROHS doesn't just apply to electronic components. If a device has electronic function, everything that's intended to stay with the device for its lifetime, with a few little exceptions, is in scope of the materials restrictions of ROHS. So if you have a carrying case for your drill, the carrying case is intended to stay with the product for its lifetime, and it's normally in scope of ROHS. Because all the mechanical components, so if you have a drill, it's obviously all the mechanical components. They also make part of the drill, all the housings, everything, all the electrical pieces. It's all the components that are intended to stay with the product for its lifetime. Manuals and CDs, etc., are actually out of scope. They're intended to be not be discarded or recycled with the electronics. What ROHS is really around, it's around preventing exposure, not to the user, prevent exposure to the recycling worker of 4 heavy metals and 2 brominated flame retardants. So it looks around what materials are part of the product upon recycling. So consumables that are used up, non-electrical consumables, like printer cartridge ink. Printer cartridge electronic, it's in scope. Printer cartridge ink is not in scope of ROHS. But all other components that are part of a medical device that's electronic in nature and intend to stay with the medical device for its lifetime are in scope. One last question, sorry I'm running a bit on time here, is if we've done testing before the medical device directive, how difficult is to move the MDR? So the way we've structured our laboratory information management system, anything we do in MDD, which we've done for a year, is structured to convert over to MDR in the future. There is some engineering evaluation. The material systems are different. We may have to do occasional tests for beryllium when you have a copper electrode in an invasive situation. But we're all structured. If you're doing MDD with us, MDR is not a big stretch. We've structured ourselves that it would take some work, but not really retesting of any significance to convert over to MDR. It's part of, again, as I mentioned before, when you're doing one of these restricted materials compliance requirements, if you're doing it properly, you should be able to structure it that you can leverage it or make variations in your process to handle the others. As I mentioned earlier, the overlap between the MDR substances and ROHS and REACH SVHC is very heavy. REACH SVHC is a few extra persistent organic pollutants, respiratory sensitizers, which are under scope of some part of the MDR, but there's a lot of materials in common. The thresholds are different, human contacting, invasive versus anywhere in the product, but a lot of the processes are similar. So as long as you modify your process properly, you should be able to handle more than one at one time. If a medical device with electronics disposables, a disposable scope of ROHS, the disposables that are consumed in the lifetime, the shorter lifetime than the product is, that are not electrical in nature, are not in scope. So if you have tubing that is regular, it's consumable as part of your device, it's not in scope. You have a printer head, a printer cartridge. The cartridge, the electronic part, is actually in scope. It's electronic, but the ink is not. That consumable is not. So any non-electrical disposable is out of scope. If it's electrical nature, it is in scope. It seems semi-arbitrary, but so says the guidance. A consumable electrical function is in scope. A consumable that is not electrical in nature is not in scope of ROHS. It may be in scope of something else, like the packaging directive, depending, but what it is. For example, the packaging for the product that's discarded when the product's put into use is not in scope of ROHS either. It's not intended to stay the product for its lifetime. However, it is in scope of the packaging directive and has its own materials restrictions. I think that's it for questions. If I didn't get to your question, if you think of something else, please feel free to contact me. Everybody who registered will receive a copy of the presentation. There should be a recording available on our website. If you like this, by the way, like this kind of presentation, probably our most popular service is quarterly updates, where it's just yourself or any stakeholders in your company. We have a web meeting like this, but unlike this meeting, it's interactive. You can ask questions, we go back and forth, we talk about MDR, and we talk about individual circumstances. You talk about, this is my product, and I have this standoff, is it an issue? And it's much more interactive, and it's very inexpensive. We do so much of it. It's very effective. It's the best way we find not only keep up to date, but be able to ask intelligent questions that apply to your product. So if you're interested in his testing or quarterly updates or any other support, feel free to contact me and I'll be happy to help. Pleasure hosting everyone again. I look forward to talking to everyone again soon.